Hello, welcome to Celestial Web's online astrology symposium. Eduardo Gramaglia from Argentina has joined me to talk on Alexandrian era of astrology. So this is a pre-recorded video, and this will be published on the date of actual schedule for the symposium. Thank you, Eduardo, for agreeing to present on the symposium, and it is an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So,
I'm honored.
Thank you so much. So, before beginning, let's just say a few words about what you're doing and what you've done. So, you began your studies in traditional astrology somewhere during early 2000s, and you published your first book on Hellenistic astrology in Spanish language by 2005, right?
Exactly. 2005 and 6, I think.
Yeah. So from then on, you have been actively involved in traditional astrology, and I think the kickstart happened when you attended the Project Hindsight conclave in 2002 or something, if I'm not wrong. So that is that is one of the turning points in your astrological career, and you've also translated various other ancient Greek texts and stuff. You're also doing your PhD in philology and linguistics. And
well, I'm constantly shifting from astrologer to translator and vice versa,
yeah,
I'm going, presently I'm translating, right?
great.
But, well, I've always been an astrologer anyway.
Absolutely. So your most recent translation work was Theophilus of Edessa, which is one of the most interesting things because Theophilus is one of the interesting astrologers who lived in the turn of the actual tradition from ancient to medieval. So I think this is the right time to actually get going into your lecture, and I'll just hand everything over to you. And it's
Okay.
first stage from now.
Okay, great. So, well, I'm here to talk about, as you can imagine, Hellenistic astrology. And it's 3 branches, okay? Of course, before we get started, we may well wonder, why not, what Hellenistic astrology really is. And I hope that it will come clear why we should study it, or at least understand its fundamentals. So what do we mean by Hellenistic astrology? A tentative definition, of course, as every definition on earth, okay? Well, by that we mean that very complex tradition of Greco-Roman astrology, which developed and was practiced in the region of the Mediterranean Sea, let's say from the 1st century before Christ on. I use before Christ, I'm not a Christian, but anyway, you understand that. We could well guess that its origin can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamia. Everyone knows that, right? The first testimonies about divination by the stars appear in tablets from the Sumerian period towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, in which we find records of astronomical observations correlated with terrestrial events. Those ancient compilation in cuneiform tablets, like the famous Enuma Anu Enlil, did not focus, and that's where I want to get to, on individual matters, but on affairs of groups, the figure of the king or ruler being only considered as the representative of a nation. And it also dealt with meteorological phenomena, earthquakes, and so on. It was mainly based upon formulae, and no traces of a difference between what we call astronomy and astrology were to be noticed. The acme seems to have been the 7th century BC during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, though a great systematization of astrological methods had already been achieved during Hammurabi's creation of the ancient Babylonian Empire. This unification process brought Sumer and Akkad into one kingdom, being the Akkadian established as its only language. So the same process of unification by which several traditions are integrated into a, let's say, pan-Mesopotamian identity is accomplished in the astrological field as well. And only calendar and the increasing records of astronomical observations give way to what is called hemerology, which in a way is what we now call electional astrology. It is interesting to note the simplicity of the divinatory statements found in Mesopotamian text. I would mention just a bit of this. One example, if there's an eclipse, there will be war, or the king will die. And such a big collection of prognosis was recorded in what today we consider the first astrological work in human history, now designated by its incipit or beginning, Anuma Anu Enlil, literally, when the gods Anu and Enlil, that was the first verse, right? That was unearthed in the 19th century as part of the amazing library of Ashurbanipal. Now, let me make a very important point here. Those ancient records of phenomena pointed to the state as a whole, or at least to the king himself as its representative. Astrology was a stately matter, and sooner or later astrologers were found working under royal patronage. The 5th century BC turns out to be of crucial importance for the history of astrology. The zodiac, consisting of 12 signs of 30 degrees each, was indeed a development of this era. But even more important for our subject, and trying to get to the subject of the branches of Hellenistic astrology, right? That it was at this very moment that natal astrology appears on the horizon. The oldest extant horoscope, now kept in a library in Oxford, dates back to 410 BC. The 28 horoscopes in cuneiform writing, which have been edited and translated by Francesca Rochford, show that those astrologers were used to forecast for the states. And those astrologers begin to translate that concept to individuals, observing the celestial map at the moment of their birth. So one may really wonder why this movement from mundane to natal astrology took place. Was it the weakening of a central government by which certain individuals who are not kings become a focus of interest of an astrological analysis which had previously been restricted to rulers? Or was it simply that the priests, they were called the Baru priests, perhaps under Persian rule, we're talking about the 7th century BC, no longer counted on royal economic support, being thus compelled to work for powerful or rich individuals? The development of natal astrology seems to have been connected with the introduction of almanacs and ephemerides around the same time. And this is particularly important. The astrologers no longer had to make observations to know the positions of the stars, but just to consult charts and records with past, present, and future emplacements. And please note this, for the first time, astrologers did not need to make observations, but just have the right tables. So we have seen that Mesopotamian astrology contributed with the first steps in mundane, natal, and even electional astrology. Now, a question that is too often asked. Was there astrology in Egypt? If there was, which was Egypt's real contribution to astrology? We cannot really deal with this extensively now, as you may well understand, but many people wonder that, and some hints may be given. And of course, it depends on what kind of astrology we're thinking of course. The Egyptians were especially interested in the rising and culmination of the stars, mainly in association with the decans, right? In very early texts, the decanates seem to have had the function of marking the hour at night, at night at which a certain star appeared over the horizon. Later on, the records included stars which reached the heaven together with a certain decan. I think the most important point here is that more than the zodiac and the ecliptical positions, the Egyptians focused on the rising and culmination of planets and stars, which reached certain points of the sky, which were signaled by the decanates, which in turn were probably determined by the position of certain fixed stars, though they certainly had ritualistic and sacred meanings as well. This indirect way of bringing the diurnal rotation of the earth to the foreground is what made some suppose that the Egyptians were the real forerunners of what was going to become one of the main contributions of Hellenistic astrological delineations, just to say the houses, in Greek, the topoi. All in all, it seems that around 500 BC, some Babylonian methods were imported into Egypt. Moreover, around 200 BC, the zodiac itself begins to appear in tomb roofs. At some stage, the decanates would turn into a system by itself, but we have to move on and leave Egypt and its mysteries for another time. So we certainly consider the death of Alexander the Great, let's just say 323 BC, as the beginning of a Hellenistic period. Greek, the language Greek, becomes the transmission means in the Mediterranean world, and the city Alexandria, its focus. It is there that a great effort in translation and adaptation into the Greek language of the astral science of Mesopotamia takes place. Let us bring our attention for a moment to a tiny but beautiful Greek island named Kos. Located not far away from today's Selçuk, that's ancient Halikarnasso, the fatherland of Herodotus. Fairly easy to reach. A ferry takes you from Selçuk to the island in 45 minutes. And the inevitable custom control as we leave Turkey and enter Greece is not too much of a problem for travelers from Argentina like me, mainly the custom agents are football or soccer fans, they usually are. They just smile and mention either Maradona or Messi, and there you go, unsearched. So sometime around the 3rd century BC, a Mesopotamian astrologer and apparently a historian too, named Berossus, started a school in this beautiful island, which was renowned from classical times to have been a healing center and home to an important temple to Asclepius. It's very beautiful to go to the island. This astrological school in Kos seems to have been the forerunner of the whole Hellenistic astrological movement. Interesting to know, the last recorded horoscope of the Mesopotamian tradition dates back to 69 AC, when the first horoscopes in Greek begin to appear in papyri. These are very short. There's one example transcribed by Van Hersen and Neugebauer in a book, a very famous one called Greek Horoscope. For instance, you see this kind of horoscope. First line, year 20 of Caesar Augustus, Missouri the 24th. Second line, to the 25th, according to the old calendar, 3rd hour of the night. Third line, the moon in Aquarius and Saturn in. Fourth line, Aquarius, the sun in Leo and Mercury. Fifth line in Leo, Mars, and the rest is destroyed. So, good example of how fragmentary the extant records may be. Well, now, yes, we're about to witness the birth of Hellenistic astrology around the 1st century BC. It would continue for several centuries, and it's somewhat misleading that all its sources come from astrologers who inhabited lands under the rule of Rome up to the 6th or 7th century AC. Do you see? Hellenistic astrology was born in Ptolemaic Egypt during Roman rule, and it is written mainly in Greek. The Greek called Koine had become the lingua franca or common language of every technical text along the Mediterranean, in a way not too different from English today. Of course, many important texts were also written in Latin, Demotic, Aramaic, Coptic, Syriac, even Syriac. Historians have agreed that the Hellenistic era begins with the death of Alexander and ends with the fall of Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, of course, in 31 AC when Rome took over Egypt. So we could say that Hellenistic astrology is that tradition of horoscopic astrology, which was practiced in the region of the Mediterranean Sea, the Mare Nostrum, from the 1st century BC up to perhaps the 7th century AC. And I said horoscopic because it used the horoscope, horoskopos, which in Greek means the watcher, skopos, of the hour, hora, and is what we called ascendant. Not horoscope, right? Ascendant. Astronomically, I mean, the intersection of the ecliptic and the horizon lines, the starting point of a 12-fold division in 12 places, topoi or houses, as we call them today. Although this concept may have originated in Egypt, as we said, its implementation and use was a Hellenistic invention. Hellenistic astrology was then the first horoscopic tradition in history. There seems to be a great concern among writers and astrologers on whether Hellenistic astrology was suddenly invented or was the result of a long-term development. Let me be honest, I fail to see the great relevance of this discussion. What seems rather evident to me is that during the Hellenistic period, someone or a group deliberately studied those ancient traditions, adapted them and combined them with newly invented techniques and substantiated them with some specific philosophical approaches. Pingree from Astral Omens enlarges upon that. It is true that it sounds suspicious that a series of radical inventions have to be accounted for and heard of until the Hellenistic period. Some of them the daily bread of modern practice, such as the doctrine of houses, topoi, the concept of aspect or configurations, in Greek schemata, syschematismoi, the introduction of a system of planetary rulerships, oikodespoteia in Greek. And to those, I would add the distinction between day and night charts called sect or heidesis. Nevertheless, it sounds difficult to think of a single source, given the great variety of techniques and even of philosophical tendencies one can deduce from the texts. Not to mention that so many texts may have been simply lost, by the way. All these things are very intelligently dealt with in Chris Brennan's book, Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. Some ancient sources assign the invention of astrology to Hermes Trismegistos in Greek, who, if we are to follow the suggestions of Clemens from Alexandria, produced a foundational text which apparently was transmitted to Asclepius, and from him to a pharaoh, Nicepso, and Petosiris, a priest, around the 2nd century BC, or to be later spread about the Mediterranean area. The key figures are thought to be, they're called pseudepigrapha, that is, mythical and important historical figures to whom certain teachings or texts were ascribed for the sake of authority and legitimacy. Now, from what can be deduced from the texts, three were the main branches of the astrological practice of the time. I say deduced because as we undertake our study of ancient traditions, we end up categorizing in a way not always explicitly found in the texts themselves. It is our attempt to cut our way towards the understanding of what may have really taken place, right? The first recognizable branch is, of course, what is called in Greek the Genethlialogike Astrologia. That's what we call natal astrology, by which we obtain information about the nature and future of a native through the study of a celestial map of the heavens at birth, of course. There comes an important point to be stressed. The Mesopotamic and Egyptian traditions were particularly focused on collective aspects, while now a new tendency is emerging, which places the interest of the study of the individual, even places the interest on the study of the individual, even when we have seen that the first steps towards natal astrology had already been taken in Mesopotamia, perhaps for political reasons. So this branch or part, if we are to use the original Greek word meros, was by far the main focus of interest in Hellenistic times. Much has been said about Hellenistic culture and its focus on individual destiny, and perhaps Hermetism and other philosophical tendencies that astrology adhered to, such as the Stoics, contributed to that or may account for that. One cannot overlook the fact that most texts come from Roman times, when astrologers were more interested in political personalities and access to power, as we will see. Now, it may seem paradoxical that the main interest in Hellenistic times will be that branch that in this talk I will but very succinctly deal with. I'm just trying to put these three branches in their place, and therefore I will perhaps concentrate more on the others in an effort to elucidate their role in Greek astrology. Ptolemy was the first to draw a clear-cut line between natal and mundane astrology. As he said in the second book of his Tetrabiblos, the forecast by astronomical means is divided into two great and principal parts. A first and more universal, which relates to whole races, countries, and cities, which is named Katholike, general. And the second and more specific, which relates to individual men, which is called Genethlialogike, genethlialogical, if we are to transliterate it into English. He believes fitting to treat first that belonging to universal matters because they are swayed by greater, more powerful causes than are particular events, as he says. And he goes on to state that weaker natures always yield to the stronger, and the particular always falls under the general. This famous last sentence is highly meaningful. Hypopiptuson de ton katameros tais katholu in Greek, or the particular always falls under the general. That is to say, natal astrology is in a way subordinated to mundane concerns. Funny to come from a writer from Hellenistic times, which placed emphasis mainly on natal astrology, though it should not escape our consideration the possibility that a towering intellectual figure such as Ptolemy might have never been a practicing astrologer, but a scholar attached to the great library who but followed typically a Hellenistic approach toward the exposition of knowledge. A second branch is alluded to in the texts as Katholike Astrologia, general astrology. And here the light is thrown on groups of people like cities or nations, as well as on natural phenomena. As we hinted before, general or universal astrology does not seem to have been widely practiced in Hellenistic tradition, at least not as much as natal astrology has. Curiously enough, many Roman astrologers served kings and emperors. We have stories which could be bloodier than modern crime stories, or more dramatic than any soap opera nowadays. The way the Emperor Domitian was killed in agreement with the direction of certain stars is in a way related to his highly unethical use of the discipline, astrology, by which he would cast charts for prominent men to then proceed to kill in cold blood those who by their star positions could become rivals. Funny how the whole thing turned against himself, as Domitian's day of death, which had been calculated by astrologers, was also known to his wife, who hired the murderers. All the mirrors he had covered the walls with were of no avail when, having asked whether the hour of danger had passed, the conspirators stabbed him on his way to the bathroom. Suetonius wrote the detailed story. Before Domitian, who belonged to the Flavian dynasty, the reign of Tiberius from the Julio-Claudian dynasty had witnessed the appearance of the official astrologer attached to an imperial court. The emperors demanded a monopoly of the art, and that can be seen in the number of edicts which condemned astrologers. However, it seems that those famous astrologers, we're talking about Thrasyllus, Balbillus, and so on, were more interested in predictions about the natal charts of powerful rulers than in worldly events involving whole countries, races, or groups. Balbillus, for instance, reminded a terrified Emperor Nero that the wrath of the gods could be deflected by executing prominent citizens, while Thrasyllus, his father, had prevented excessive killing by reminding the fearful Tiberius of his predestined long life. The killing incidentally demonstrated the omens, as the appearance of a comet, for instance, was in a way inevitably followed by bloodshed. But then again, it was the natal charts of prominent people their focus of interest. Interesting to note that according to Pingree, the great philologer, what we call historical astrology, with its focus on cyclic conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in each triplicity, was invented by Sasanian Persian astrologers around the 3rd to 6th centuries after Christ. During the Hellenistic period, the second book of Ptolemy's Tetrabibulus is perhaps the main description of methods on how to approach the astrological interpretation of worldly events. We have seen how Ptolemy for the first time structured the study into defined areas. Astronomy was divided from astrology, and this latter was in turn subdivided into natal and global concerns. It was no doubt Ptolemy who made it through the religious controversies involving astrology. The words of Ptolemy were more like the speech of a scientist, and at the same time, let's say, tinged with a lot of ingenuity, as the assignments of rulership to lands and countries show. In this sense, Manilius was not different when he also wrote on mundane matters in his didactic poem. When, for example, Ptolemy assigned the fire element to Europe, the northwest quarter of his division of the earth that was known to him, his conclusions were, for example, that Europeans are, among other things, independent, warlike, magnanimous, and homosexual, without passion for women and better satisfied with men. Rather big a generalization for a whole continent, isn't it? But the main rules for the consideration of cities, even prevalent nowadays, were already laid down by him. The foundation date of a city is not known. Ptolemy advises to proceed to a very interesting identification of the king and the city. One should take the midheaven of the king's chart or its ruler. The strongest cause of problems are, of course, eclipses, and also Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Mundane astrology survived the upheavals of Christian vandalism. As a matter of fact, when the church edicts of the 4th century condemned astrology as heresy, this accusation was directed to natal and not to mundane astrology, which continued to be highly practiced and praised within the church. The Vatican, right? Okay, let's not dive into that. We will now consider a very special set of techniques that could be thought of as a third branch of the Hellenistic astrological practice. The method by which the astrologer taps information on the quality, nature, and future development of an event or undertaking activity through the examination of the celestial map at the very moment of inception. Thus, we have charts for the foundation of cities, for a marriage, for the setting up of some business, beginning of an illness, a beginning, in Greek, katarche, a beginning, an inception. The aim is to ascertain the potential result, or αποτέλεσμα in Greek, the study of the effects of the given configurations. This may consist of the chart of a certain event or the conscious choice of a starting point in which the planetary positions are seen to ensure an auspicious end. This is what we now call electional astrology, and this was widely used in Hellenistic times, I believe, to start actions with the goal of ensuring a favorable result. Those interested in medical astrology would do well to bear in mind that in ancient times, health was not a matter that belonged to natal astrology. The chart cast for the first symptoms of a disease drawn for the moment in which the native took to bed, kataklisis in Greek, the same word as decumbitura in Latin, would give information on how serious that condition was and how it had to be treated, what hope of recovery there was, and whether the result would be healing, a chronic condition, or even death. In other words, another type of event chart, in the sense of taking the emergence of a disease as a point of departure, and in a way also of horary chart, as the question whether the patient would recover was always implicit, and the examination of the chart would give information on what would follow. One of the most ancient texts on this mode of astrological analysis is found in a fragment attributed to Hermes, which quotes Dorotheus, that's to say, 1st century BC, reason enough to suspect that it was not Hermes himself who wrote it. Such fragments, with the heading "Another Consultation of the Moment of Taking to Bed," assigns the ascendant to the physician, the midheaven to the diseased, the descendant to the illness itself, the IC to the treatment, with a strong emphasis laid on the position of the moon. Eventually, another type of chart would emerge, the consultation chart, that is what Benjamin Dykes calls thought interpretation chart, which were drawn for the very moment at which someone consults an astrologer. The chart would determine what the client has in mind or his real motivations to consult an astrologer. Now that we are dealing with the branches of Hellenistic astrology, I think it is fair for us to wonder when what we call horary astrology really emerges. Was a later Indian, Arabic, or Persian development, or did it exist as a definite and established set of practices and techniques in Hellenistic times? Can we trace a connection between Hellenistic questions, erotesseis in Greek, and the prashna marga of Sanskrit Jyotish texts? The oldest extant text on inceptional astrology is the 5th book of the Carmen Astrologicum of Dorotheus of Sidon, which contains scarce references to this type of astrology based on questions to be answered. The main bulk of the text is concerned with electional matters, as we know. However, let me quote from the 3rd book of Hephaestion, Apotelesmatics. Let me share well, I want to find the picture of the book. So that, there it is. There we go. Where is that? Okay, never mind. I'll show it to you later. So I'll find it, don't worry. Let me quote then from the third book of Hephaestion Apotelesmatics, translated by myself and edited and published by Benjamin Dykes. This text, as I hope, and Chris Brennan has also pointed this out in his book, will at least be a confirmation that this horary practice was at least known, if not widely practiced, in the Hellenistic era. On the other side, it will also suggest that what is found on this matter in the fifth book of Dorotheus does not necessarily reveal later interpolations and corruptions, as was once thought. This is how the text reads. In Hephaestion, I'm reading from Hephaestion's third book of Apotelesmatics. When the observation of the hour of the inception of the runaway is uncertain, it is necessary to place the hour marker, the ascendant, at the time when the master of the runaway first heard the message about the flight. And another very meaningful one. In the inception in which the separation of the spouses, of husband and wife, occurs, or else at the time that someone inquires from you, look at Venus and the sun, etc. So this would lead us to conclude that to this astrologer, at least, both the moment at which one hears about the event and that of the consultation itself were also deemed important, though perhaps not so much as the moment of the event itself, which, by the way, might never have been known. Now, a particularly noteworthy example is found in a monumental compilation of Greek astrological texts. And this I need to show. The chart. I'm looking for a chart, right? It was here and now I don't find it. It's this chart. And this is it. This is it. So a particularly noteworthy example is found in a monumental compilation of Greek astrological texts from codices from several European libraries, the CCAG or...
One moment, Eduardo, I think it is not appearing properly. Can you just close the share and reshare it again?
Let's... Okay. There?
Yeah, it's fine now. Thanks.
Yeah. So you see now?
Yes, it's there. Thanks.
It's there. So I was talking about that monumental compilation of Greek astrological writings and texts from codices from several European libraries. It is called the CCAG, the catalog of the codices of the Greek astrologers. This 12-volume collection was started by Franz Cumont in 1898, only to be concluded after the Second World War. In its first volume, a very interesting example of a horary question and its answer can be found. It is attributed to an astrologer named Palkus, and it was formulated around the 5th century. You just look at the date. It's July 479, that's 5th century. It took place in Smyrna. It's today's Turkey, right? Ancient Asia Minor. And the text says that it's about a fear for a ship. You'll see why I'm trying to bring up this example particularly. Here, the astrologer was seemingly trying to make a judgment about what had happened to a ship from which no news had been received since its departure. Let us take a look at it. You may hear a train of reasoning the average modern astrologer is not commonly familiar with. So in the translation of the text, we first found a description of the subject of the inquiry, in which the problem is said to have been that a ship had been lost. And the text reads, "The lot of fortune in Sagittarius, together with the constellation of Argo, rose, and Jupiter, ruler of Argo, as it rises with Sagittarius, is in Aquarius, a water sign." Then comes the first inquiry: what happened to the ship? The text, "Taking the ruler of the day and of the first hour and the ruler of the third hour, Saturn and Mars, and again having observed Saturn and Mars to be on the ascendant, Virgo, and the moon moving towards Saturn, hence I said that the ship had encountered a great storm, but had been saved because Venus in Gemini in the midheaven and the moon in Scorpio were both in aspect to Jupiter in Aquarius. And the moon's position on the 7th day was separating from Jupiter, having also observed that the ascendant was in a bicorporeal, double-bodied or common sign, Virgo, and that Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant, was retrograde, and that the ruler of the midheaven in Taurus, Venus, was also in a common or bicorporeal sign, and Jupiter, ruler of fortune in Sag, was also in a bicorporeal sign, and the house ruler of the moon, Mars, as well, in Virgo. I said that they would change from ship to ship. Then comes the question, what does the ship contain? And because Virgo was a wind sign and also Sagittarius, I said that they were bringing some feathered things with them. And because the moon was in Scorpio, the domicile of Mars, and in the terms of Mercury, I said that they were probably bringing books and papyrus with them, together with some bronze objects because of Scorpio. Having noted that Asclepius, that's an equivalent name for the constellation of Ophiuchus, was rising with the moon in Scorpio, I said that they were bringing medical implements with them. And then the question, when will the ship return? And as regards when the ship would return, I declared that the moon would be in Aquarius or Pisces. In Aquarius because of the moon's position on the 7th day, and because fortune in Sagittarius was moving towards Jupiter in Aquarius. In Pisces because of its motion towards its own domicile ruler. And the result. They arrived on the 8th day with the moon in Aquarius, and being asked, they spoke about the delay and said that there had been an upheaval at sea, and as the sea parted, the rudder struck a rock and was broken, and they were driven astray by the storm. Having reached harbor, they transferred the cargo from another ship to another ship, on which they came back bringing indeed ostrich feathers and plain papyrus because Mercury was retrograde, and cooking implements because of Scorpio, and a shipload of medical supplies because of Asclepius. So let us take a brief look at some aspects that emerge from this most intriguing text. The moon squaring Jupiter is one of the reasons why the ship was saved, and the moon moving towards a sextile to Saturn is used to account for the dangerous storm they had encountered. In this system, Jupiter is naturally benefic and Saturn malefic, though it is their emplacement and dignity in the first place what determine their influence. By the way, let me relate to my latest translation, also edited by Benjamin Dykes, Theophilus of Edessa, whom I will soon mention again, portends great storms when Saturn transits the middle of the constellation Virgo. The examination of the position of the moon on the third and seventh day does not surprise us, as they were common practice in Hellenistic astrology. What I really found extraordinary is the mention of extra zodiacal constellations as sources of influences and significations, though always closely related to the sign with which the Earth rotation brings them to appear on the horizon. Some might have also noticed the iconography-based categorization of signs. Aquarius is a watery sign because of the water bearer, and both Virgo and Sagittarius appear as winged signs because of the ancient iconography of the winged maiden with the ear of corn in the case of Virgo, and due to the flying arrow in the case of Sagittarius. The feature of being double-bodied or bicorporeal modern common signs, was due to the fact that those signs partake of the seasonal influence of the solid signs that precede them, and of the tropical or cardinal signs that follow them. Not less interesting is the fact that such an early astrologer points to the constellation of Ophiuchus as related to Scorpio, with which it rose at the time. We can clearly see that the texts mirror an era in which there could be found a relative coincidence of the tropical and sidereal zodiacs. Even more important, what the text contains is too close to what has been called consultation chart, and what Benjamin Dykes termed thought interpretation chart, by which the astrologer guesses what the inquiry is about based on the chart drawn at the very moment of being consulted. The fact that he answers questions such as what the ship contains or whether or when they would return clearly reveals that horary techniques were really a part of the Hellenistic tradition. Another important point I would like to bring up is how the Hellenistic tradition came to us. After the 2nd century after Christ, the Hellenistic texts were passed on to other cultures, where they were subsequently translated, adapted, and, as we can well imagine, enlarged with additional methods and techniques. We have seen how the Sasanian Persian astrologers came up with historical astrology, and around the 3rd century, the interrogational astrology seems to have found its way into Persian astrology and perhaps into Hindu astrology as well. Now, let me make something very clear. As a Sanskrit learner, I support and stand up for the great antiquity of Indian's tradition. However, it does not seem far-fetched to me that a great interchange of ideas was taking place in the ancient world. In the same way that it is becoming increasingly foolish, if you let me use that adjective, to turn a blind eye to the fact that great thinkers of the Western past have traveled and tapped from Indian and Babylonian sources, it might not be impossible that some text could have reached India and contributed to the ancient tradition of Jyotisha. I really believe that India is a lost chapter of Western history, and if Indo-European linguistics has already confirmed the relationship between Sanskrit and European languages, I don't see why we insist on forcing India to its exotic place in faraway Eastern lands, being as it is perhaps more than we can imagine, so much a part of our lineage. One of the texts that seem to reach India is the Yavana Jataka, which could have contributed to the development of the Prashna Marga, or the path of questions. Let me quote just a bit from it in chapter 52:8. The text reads, those who are successful as astrologers say that the thoughts of the inquirer depends on the nature of the planet, the signs that they occupy, etc. This led Pingree to risk that there was a development of horary astrology in India as a result of this text having reached its shores. Eventually, the medieval tradition would be fed by Hellenistic, Persian, and Hindu sources, and late ancient astrologers, or if you wish, early medieval ones, such as Theophilus of Edessa, Mashala, and Sal, stand as witness. Aside from all transmissions to India and Persia, the stream that took the astrological lore to the Muslim empire is particularly meaningful. In the Islam, it thrived and flourished in the middle of the 8th century, in an era known as the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasids were really prone to erudition and developed a significant interest for astrology. Baghdad, founded in 762, astrologers were hired to elect the moment of its founding in July the 31st, becomes a new focus of culture, as Alexandria had been before. In this context, the most interesting astrologer is born, not just because Benjamin Dykes and I have recently published his works, but because it is of great interest to understand this fascinating period in history when all the Hellenistic tradition was being translated and reinterpreted from Greek into Arabic. Theophilus of Edessa was born in 695, and was the main astrologer of the Caliph Al-Mahdi, as Dykes explains in the prologue to the translated book. As a Syrian, he was rich and had been well educated, probably in a famous city nearby, Haran, well known as a center of astronomy, astrology, and magic. There's a second reason why I mentioned Theophilus, the first one being that you could order the book, of course. He helps us throw some light on how horary astrology was being developed at that time. As the court astrologer, he is thought to have directly witnessed and supposedly even elected the right moment to start battles. For instance, in a text called Labors Concerning Military Elections, he reasons this way. The heaven and the sun signify the ruling king, while the ascendant and the moon, the local tyrant that decided to break free, escaping the authority of that king. Benjamin Dykes immediately realized the resemblance of this text with Dorotheus' Carmen 537. Here, Dorotheus assigns the heaven and the sun to the master, and the ascendant and the moon to the flying slave. Theophilus, using the same delineation, adapts Dorotheus' rules to a very specific war conflict, thus turning electional rules into horary ones. Mashallah and Sal seem to have been busy doing the same thing as Dykes suggests. The complete work, as far as today can be reconstructed, was published by Benjamin Dykes last year. I did the translation not only from the already published texts in the CCAG, the catalog, but also from the manuscripts themselves, codices found in several European libraries, the Vatican included. I always wonder whether the Vatican Library is conscious of the forbidden treasures they have on their bookshelves. Theophilus of Edessa was translated from Hellenistic sources. That is why he's an important figure of the history of astrology, even though he was not known to posterity, perhaps because he was a war astrology and handled secret information, as Dykes guesses, perhaps for other reasons as well, who knows. But I would like to point out that genuine horary questions are found in this text, which shows that interrogational astrology was widely practiced in the Hellenistic world. The Codex Laurentianus 2834, for instance, contains electional rules for the most auspicious moment to send a letter. But the curious thing is that another source shows a very similar text attributed to Zoroaster, in which the writer poses the question of what does a letter contain, a genuine horary question, a thought interpretation chart. So electional astrology, as an established practice, at least since Dorotheus, gave way to the habit of drawing charts for the moment at which some news were heard, and eventually this would lead to drawing charts for the very moment of the consultation, with the aim not only of answering questions about the future development and result of some matter, but also with the intention of guessing what the client had in mind. About this, Benjamin Dice has talked very much, okay? This would naturally simplify the whole thing, as the moment was the time at which the astrologer is consulted, the sacred time, so to say. It is now that what we call horary is born, just as the medieval tradition received it, probably between the 3rd and the 7th or 8th centuries. Dorotheus would remain forever the basis of this tradition. Hephaestion of Thebes would be based upon him. The first thorough treatises on this matter are seen to appear during the 8th century and are those by Theophilus, Mashala, and Sal. These last two, both Jewish astrologers of Persian origin, would be remembered, quoted, copied, and even plagiarized during the Middle Ages. For some reason, this did not happen to Theophilus. Horary astrology would undergo an intensive development in the bosom of the Arabic tradition, as we know. In the end, we are left with a question, of not so difficult answer, by the way, but why Hellenistic astrology forged its own way toward a more personalized manner of astrology, in which the individual was the focus. At the time of Berossus' landing in Greek territory, Stoics were formulating their own philosophical approach toward man's destiny and its insertion within the whole. The future of man could be known because, in a way, man was a resemblance or a reflection of the universe itself. And with this, let us call it deterministic, though by no means fatalistic approach, the development of natal astrology was in a most specific way linked. Thus we find in Hellenistic time techniques previously never heard of, the concept of the horoscope or ascendant, which gives birth to the division in houses or topoi, a whole system of rulership by which a planet could be dignified according to its familiarity with the place, namely sign, exaltation, bound, triplicity, or decanate, in which it is found. The concept of aspect, of configuration, the concept of hieresis, sect, as well as a complex set of techniques for the calculation of the duration of life and prognosis in general. But these are all techniques that really deserve a separate treatment. So thank you very much. I hope it was not too long.
No, it was okay, but I think if you can just stop the screen sharing, if you don't have any more, I think it will be better so that people can see you.
Sorry, what should I do?
No, you can just stop the screen sharing, which will be above the, it will be on the top.
Wait, something. What is that?
Okay, I think I was able to stop it. Don't worry. So that was a very enlightening lecture, Eduardo. I think my friend Fernando Raul has joined.
Oh yeah, Fernando. Yeah.
Yeah, Fernando Raul has joined, and he has really liked it. So I know, but I'm sure the moment I post this on my Facebook page, I'm sure there will be so many questions. So as of now, let's ask if Fernando has something to say, and I'll just allow him to talk. Hello, Fernando. Yeah, Fernando, you can talk now.
there we go. Greetings,
Oh,
how are you?
okay. Thank you for joining, man. Thank you for joining on a very short notice, because I kind of sent out the email for this talk just 1 hour before the actual schedule. Okay, so thank you so much for joining. And if you have something, you can just ask to Eduardo directly, because at this point I think you have the liberty to do so, but I'm not sure if the same thing will happen on the actual symposium days. So
Oh, I don't have any specific questions. I just find it very interesting how Horary began as a mixture of both Indian, Islamic, and obviously Hellenistic astrologies all mixed together in a way.
okay, okay, great. Thank you so much, Fernando, and we'll see how it's still just 1 week away from the actual conference, so we'll see you soon.
Nice to see you. Saludos, Gramaglia.
Saludos, Fernando. Saludos.
Okay.
Gracias.
Okay, so yeah, as Fernando said, it was a very interesting thing. There was a lot of information. I think I have to watch it at least 1 or 2 times more to kind of get a hold or digest all those information, because you kind of it was. I'm sure it would have been, at least for me, it is a very difficult job to kind of tie in everything from 3rd century BC to 7th century or 8th century AD until Theophilus of Edessa. And you also spoke about Masha Allah and others. And you started from actually Mesopotamian and Babylonian astrology. So it was a long way, and
A long way, yeah.
yeah, it was a.
But I have to reach Theophilus because that's the book we translated last year. So
Sure.
I have to get to the 8th century. Okay.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think Theophilus will act as a perfect end to talk about the Hellenistic tradition, and Theophilus will also be a perfect beginning point to start with the medieval tradition of astrology. So I think it was a super formidable job in how you presented your lecture, and someone who really likes history like me will surely like this lecture. And it is not necessary that you need to like history, but it is important. I think I would surely recommend people to check out this lecture, because it is important to know where our traditions actually originated, and how far we have come from long way back, from about 300 years.
In a way, I was thinking that if we're going to talk or do other talks about Hellenistic astrology, we first have to present or introduce what Hellenistic astrology was and its scope, in time, in what it encompassed, and the main branches. Maybe next time we can be more specific about certain aspect, right?
Sure, great. I think it was a wonderful lecture, and I'm sure I'm going to watch it at least 1 or 2 more times.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll kind of post all the details to contact you, and I'll also share the links to your books. I'd surely recommend people to get your latest book, which is Theophilus of Edessa. You translated it, and Dr. Ben Dykes edited and published it. So, and there is a lot of unfound stuff that is actually, lost stuff that is kind of coming back to us again, and you are playing a major role in reviving the ancient traditions of astrology. And thank you so much for doing that, and thank you so much for lecturing here and honoring us as well.
Okay. Thank you for having me, of course.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks.